Welcome back to the Ultimate Mixdown for part 2 of the series, recording a song from start to finish. In the last video, we went over how to configure your hardware and set up your software for recording music. We ended that video with creating a guide track that we'll use as the basis of our project. In this video, we're going to bring in the drums. One thing you'll note that's a little different is that I added these markers at each of the different sections in the song. This helps us get back to any certain point in the song that we were working on in case we lose our spot. To add a marker, you can click the M key in Reaper. It'll say add marker, and then you give it a name. And then it places the marker in the timeline. In other DAWs, you can go to insert marker. Once you have your marker set, you're ready to create your drums track and start programming your drums. So again, to create a new track in Reaper, you double click the track control panel, or you can do insert track or Command T. The first thing you always want to do when you create a new track is name it. So you can double click at the top for the title and we'll put drums. Now instrument tracks work differently in different DAWs. So in Reaper, every track behaves the same. So you could create a new track and it could be used for audio, it could be used for Midi, it could be used for instrument tracks. There's really no difference in how you set up the tracks. In other software, you could use an instrument track. And in some cases, you might need to create a Midi track that feeds into an instrument track so that the Midi notes are triggering the sounds that come out of your VST in the instrument track, and you can hear it back in your headphones. We don't need any kind of audio source coming in. One thing that we can use is a MIDI controller or a MIDI keyboard that we'll be able to use to audition the drums, but you don't need that if you don't have it. In this case, I have a MIDI keyboard, so I'll go to Input, MIDI, and I'll select my keyboard. Once you set your input, you can click on the Insert, and we'll add our drum effect. So the software that I'm going to use is Easy Drummer. This is a paid plugin, but there are also a number of free options you can use. The Addictive Drums and Slate Digital have demo versions where they have at least 1 or 2 free kits that you can use. There's also MT Power Kit 2 that has some decent drums for free. But again, in this case, we're going to use Easy Drummer, so select your plugin and click Add. So in most drum plugins, the first thing you're going to see is the drum kit available where you can audition the sounds. To audition, all you have to do is click on the drums. Or you can audition them by clicking on your MIDI controller or your MIDI keyboard, as long as you have the pads or the keys mapped to the appropriate drums. Just make sure that you have record and input monitoring on if you're auditioning from your MIDI controller or your MIDI keyboard. Now, one of the most useful features of this drum plugins is the groove templates that come with them. So oftentimes you'll see a MIDI groove that you can pull into your project, and then you can tweak them and adjust them later on. In Easy Drummer, the grooves are under the Search tab, and other software, it might be called a Grooves page that you can look at. To audition any one of them, press the play button next to the groove. One very useful feature is the filters that come with the grooves, so you can filter it by different genres, different types. The drum kit I'm going to be working with is the Metal Machine Distorted. I just like the way these drums sound, and they sound very good with the song that we're building. Most drum software has a follow host button that you can click, and what that does is not only maps the tempo inside the drum software with your song, it also starts and stops the drum software while it plays with your DAW. So to show that, I'll grab any one of these grooves and pull it down to the MIDI capture below. I'm going to set it at bar 2 because that's where our song starts in the DAW. And then if I set my playback to the beginning of the song and I press spacebar or play to play the song, you should hear this drum groove play along with my song. Now in other drum software, you might need to filter on the grooves and play back the grooves along with your song until you find something that matches close to what you're looking for. In Easy Drummer, there's a functionality called Tap to Find that's very useful. What happens is when you click this button, it brings up the Tap to Find page, and it'll click off with a metronome that's mapped to your DAW. You can play a drum groove, and once you finish, you can click Show Results. Then it'll give you a list of grooves that match that drum pattern. So let me show you how that works. So let's audition these along with the intro of our song and see if any one of these suffices for what we're looking for. Another thing to note is that you can sort the results here. So if you sort by name, it'll usually sort by bridge, chorus, intro. These aren't set in stone, so if you find something that says chorus, but you like it on an intro or a verse, that's completely fine. This is your song. In my case, I'm going to sort by the percent matching again, so I get the closest match. So I'll click play to audition the groove, and I'll press spacebar on my keyboard so that I can play the song on my DAW, and we'll hear how that sounds together. So like I mentioned before, once you find a groove that you like, you can pull it down to the MIDI capture. And what we're going to do in this video is build out an entire song in this MIDI capture, and then we'll pull the MIDI data from here into our DAW for fine tuning. So I'll pull this down again to bar 2 because that's where our song starts. So we can take a listen. The next part of the song is this riff right here. So in this case, I was thinking of alternating snares and kicks, kind of like a punk vibe. So I'm going to do this tap to find again, and then play that pattern. Let's take a listen to our results. So this one fits pretty well, so I'll pull that in. So in our song, we have 4 bars for this riff. So I'll bring this back down to 4 bars. And then there's a little thing that goes on at the end that doesn't match this pattern, so I'm going to try to find a fill that fits that. And then we need to reduce this to the size of our clip. And what I liked about it was the second half of this fill groove. So I'll reduce it this way and pull it back. That sounds good. Okay, now this takes us to our first verse. So the guitar for the verse again goes like this. So what I'm thinking for this section is something that's relatively clean, not too busy. Again, I'll search for a groove for that. Okay, I'll sort on names, see if they have any verse options that come up. Not too much with a high percentage, but let's take a listen. So this one sounds like it'll fit pretty well, but it's a little too busy. That's not a problem though. We can pull this in now, and then we can remove some notes later on. Now there's a few options too in Easy Drummer and in some other drum software where you can edit the grooves themselves directly in the software. So even before having to export the MIDI and making changes there in our DAW, we can just double click on the groove. This allows us to change up our power hand or our open hit. So right now our power hand is on the hi-hat. But we could simply move that over to this crash. For the verse, I like it at the hi-hat, so I'll move that back. Then another thing you can do is adjust the amount. By adjusting the amount, it'll reduce the MIDI notes in the groove or increase the MIDI notes in the groove. And what that translates to is it'll play more or less notes from the drum kit overall. Right now we're right in the middle of the road, so that's what this sounds like. All All right, if we reduce the amount, it sounds like this. That actually sounds pretty good for what I'm looking for. If we increase the amount, then it sounds like this. So you can tell that this pattern is getting filled up by additional cymbals and an additional kick or snare here and there. So I'm going to leave the amount on low because this is the very opening of a quiet section in the song. And then lastly, you can adjust the velocity being how hard the drums hit. Most drum software plugins have a velocity meter so that you can do those types of adjustments. But now I'm going to leave this alone. I like where the velocity is, and then we can move on with the rest of our song. And we're doing a decent job pulling in different MIDI grooves, but we don't want the entire verse to sound the same. So what we can do is we can copy the MIDI groove that we have here for the first half of the verse by holding Alt, click and drag. And then we can open up the MIDI groove and we can switch that power hand maybe to a more open hi-hat. And then we can increase the amount as well. And then what this is doing is this is going to make the hi-hat louder and more open. And then we're going to hear even more drums played in the groove. And that just helps with the build up to the chorus. So the difference between the first half of the verse and then the second half of the verse. So now we have a little fill here that we need to fill in. We'll find a groove that matches this. Okay, so we found our groove. Now to put this in here, what we can do is we can again copy this groove, pull this one back to where the fill belongs. Then we can pull in the fill groove. And then the last thing we need to do is adjust the size of this copied groove so that it only fills out the rest of the verse and doesn't go into the chorus. So we'll dial this back and then we'll bring it back into our sequence, and that should get us to the pre-chorus. Okay, and here's our pre-chorus. And the pre-chorus follows a similar pattern to this little fill here. So what I'll do is I'll copy this fill over, and then I'll make tweaks once we pull our MIDI data into our DAW. So typically in a song, a chorus or a hook is one of the most exciting parts of the song. So here I'm looking for something that has a very straight beat with open cymbals and hard-hitting kicks and snares. So the chorus of the song sounds like this. Okay, so let's find a pattern that matches that. So I like this groove, but I want the power hand to be on a crash. So what I can do is pull this groove down into our MIDI capture. Then again, double click on the groove, and I'll change the power hand from the hi-hat to this crash right here. So now let's take a listen with the music. Now that you've seen how we do an intro, a pre-chorus, you can build out the rest of the song this exact way. So what I mean by that is I'll take the verse 1, pre-chorus 1, and chorus 1 grooves that I've already configured and copy them right over to verse 2, pre-chorus 2, and chorus 2 since they follow the exact same number of bars. And then later on, I'll make tweaks in the MIDI editor so that I can add notes, adjust velocities, change up some of the drums. So let's hear what verse 2 sounds just pulling in a copy of what we already had. Okay, and once you've gone through your song part by part and found the drum grooves that you want to use, you can take all of the MIDI data from that MIDI capture and pull it right into your DAW. Highlight all of the grooves in your capture, so click the first one and then hold shift and click the last one. And then you can drag that right into your song. And then when you press play, you should be able to hear the drums for that drum track. Now to edit MIDI data, you have to open the MIDI window. In Reaper, that's just double clicking on the item in your MIDI track. One thing that's really useful is knowing what drums are mapped to which sounds. So in Midi, you can actually audition these by clicking on the keys in the piano roll here. And in Reaper, you can actually name these keys by double pressing the right click on your mouse. So in this case, I'll do kick. So there's two snares here. So this one I'll do snare bottom. And here I'll do snare top. Okay, and you can go up the line just so that's easier to read as you're working. So now in the MIDI editor, you have a lot of options you can work with to make this sound like a more put together track. One thing you can do is you can move notes around. So if you didn't want one type of cymbal, you could move it up to a different type of cymbal. If you have something that was out of time, you can move the note around by clicking and dragging. You can copy the notes as well. So I've set my command to holding the Alt key and then click and drag to copy the notes. If I wanted a few extra kick drums, I could copy the notes across. Then it'll sound like this. You can also draw in new notes. So you can go anywhere in your MIDI editor, and by default, Reaper lets you draw notes by clicking and dragging. And in a lot of DAWs, it's double click to add a new note. So as you can see, there's a lot of ways you can tweak your MIDI track just so that you have the exact pattern that you're looking for. You have the right drums playing at the right time, or if something was out of time, you can move it in time. The last thing I want to talk about briefly in this video is quantization and velocity. So quantization is a way that you can bring notes exactly to the grid if you have drums that are slightly out of time. For example, I have one kick drum on the beat and then I have three that are off the beat. I can select them all, and in Reaper, you can go to your actions list by holding shift and pressing slash. And in your actions list, you can look up quantize. And quantize is right now set to my Q key. So I can either double click right here and quantize the notes, or I can press the Q key on my keyboard. And then if I have 100% strength, then it's going to quantize 100% to the grid. So now if you listen to these kick drums, they'll be 100% perfectly on the grid. But oftentimes drummers aren't that perfect. And while in songs you want to have the kick and snares relatively close to the grid, sometimes there's going to be notes that are just slightly off, and that's okay. That's a more realistic feel. And that's one way to humanize your drums. Another way to humanize drums is by adjusting velocities. Drummers aren't going to play the same drum with the exact same level of force throughout the entire song. So you can select the note and adjust its velocity down below. So a lower velocity means that the drum will play with a softer hit, and a higher velocity means that it'll play with a louder hit. For most kicks in a straight pattern where you're not doing a double kick, you can have it relatively hard hitting with the velocities, same with snares. But when you're doing things like snare rolls or double kick, one useful thing to do is alternating the velocity, so having what would be the strong foot of the kick, usually the first note in the pattern, and then every other from there, and then the alternate, so the second note in the pattern, and then every other would be a little softer. So I'll copy in some kicks. Okay, so now the kicks are all like this. And as you can tell, because they're all the same or relatively the same velocity, it sounds more like a machine gun than an actual kick drum. So we can take the alternating kick drums, dial the velocity of those drums back, and then it'll sound more realistic like this. So once you have your MIDI notes set, you've adjusted the timing and the velocities so that it follows the feel of your song, building up at points with high energy and dialing it back a little bit at points with low energy, then you're ready to move forward with the rest of your song. One last thing I like to do before the mixing stage is take this MIDI track, bring it back into Easy Drummer, and then exporting the drums each onto their own separate audio tracks so that we can use that in the mixing process down the road. At this point though, we're ready to record our guitars and move along in the recording process of our song. So if you found this useful, stick around because the next video is going to show you how to record bass and electric guitar.